not quite as uniform, but it's still, I have my work black pants, I have my relaxing black pants, and I have my fancy black pants. And that's all Chaol has. And that just cracks me up.
Hi everyone! Welcome back to the Book Dump Fantasy Podcast. We, Addison and Lorraine, are two best friends who explore the wonderful world of fantasy through books, shows, and movies, but with a heavy emphasis on books. This episode, we are covering the bonus chapter titled The Captain and the Prince. And this was another one of the few bonus chapters released for the Throne of Glass series. This chapter was intended to be read after TOG and Tab, but we already read Crown of Midnight as well. And since we read The Assassin's Blade third in our reading order, so this is coming after we've read all of those first three books. Like the bonus chapters previously, I thought this was just a nice bit of background info and contextualization for characters. And in this case, it was nice to get, I think, more of the inside thoughts from Dorian specifically, since he is, you know, one of the main characters in this series.
Yeah, I really liked the short story because it was very short. So it was easy to do the notes and just keeping it real. And secondly, there were a lot of little Easter eggs and references to just some of the Assassin's Blade. And so that was really exciting because I'm like, oh, I know what they're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I wouldn't say there was too much stuff that I was analyzing necessarily. There was just really the confirmation that they had attended the party that we read about in the Underworld story. And I was like, yes. And that was
I know
about it. So,
yeah.
As a quick reminder, there will definitely be spoilers for The Assassin's Blade, Throne of Glass, and Crown of Midnight. If you haven't read these books yet, then please pause here, catch up first, and then come back when you're caught up. Furthermore, we would like to remind everyone that this is an adult podcast where we will have explicit conversations. Explicit language or potentially triggering topics may be discussed, so please be mindful of that and adjust accordingly. All right, so getting into the actual episode, we decided to place this short story after our final Assassin's Blade episode, and it should be released after the final Tab story titled The Assassin and the Empire comes out as well. So you can expect those to come out around the same time. And that's really it. So let's get into the episode. We will continue with a quick little summary with the book report, and then we'll deep dive with an analysis, and then we'll do our favorite moments at the end. Also, if you enjoy the podcast and you'd like to support the show, the very best way for you to do that is to rate and review this podcast. This greatly helps us on the platforms and helps us grow our community of fellow book lovers as well.
Yes, and in the spirit of growing our book community, please share the Book Dump Fantasy Podcast with your friends. That is the other best way to support the show, is just tell anyone and everyone, strangers, your grandma, anyone who likes to read, that this is a great book series and we would love to share it with them.
Yes.
I'm glad you agree, Lorraine. I'm glad you agree.
With that being said, Addison, please give us the book report.
Happily. The Captain and the Prince. It's the height of summer in Rifthold and it's hot as hell. Dorian, our darling prince, and Chaol, our big tough guy, are hanging out in Dorian's room in the glass castle. Dorian contemplates the recent contest his father had decided to host, while Chaol stares at some boring report or whatever papers Chaol likes to pretend to read. Chaol and Dorian discuss the upcoming champions contest, more specifically who Dorian will pick as his champion. An angry Dorian says he thinks the whole thing is ridiculous to start with and doesn't want to pick a champion. But as always, Chaol reminds him that it's better for him to play the king's game and tread cautiously when defying him. Chaol makes some suggestions on who Dorian could select, but they're all just too ordinary, and they aren't pretty to look at either. And if he's going to participate in this ridiculous charade, then he may as well try and win. Dorian suggests Celaena Sardothian, Adarlan's assassin, and although she was recently incarcerated and sentenced to 9 lives worth of labor in the harsh salt mines of Endovier, she's probably still the best. Chaol tries to pump the brakes on that hard, but Dorian insists. Chaol finally agrees to go, but only if Dorian agrees to some terms and conditions. Dorian finds most of them palatable, but insists the final decision on whether to use Celaena as a champion has to be a decision they make together. Chaol begrudgingly agrees, and the two begin making plans to head to the salt mines of Endovir. I know.
They picked Celaena.
What? Spoilers, Lorene, spoilers.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, thank you for the book report. And now let's get into the analysis.
Yes, let's. So before we begin, I have a couple things I want to add at the top of the episode very quickly. The first is we will link this in the episode description. For those of you that listen to the other bonus chapters, the assassin and the princess and the assassin and the captain, you've already heard this precursor, but it's on a webpage and it's a little hard to find. Down at the bottom, there's like a white box with a tiny little blue hyperlink. That's where the story is. So I promise it's on there. Lorraine and I had many struggles trying to locate it, but we did eventually find it. So I just wanted to let you guys know so you're not struggle busting like we were. And then secondly, be sure to listen to our other bonus scene episodes. At this point, we are all caught up chronologically with bonus episodes. There is going to be one for Heir of Fire, I think around chapter 45-ish, but we'll give you a heads up when we get there. But yeah, go check out the other ones if you haven't listened already. And next, I want to talk about just kind of my initial thought about this scene, short story, whatever you want to call it. I liked it a lot. It's pretty short, even compared to the other ones. But I did think that it did a good job showcasing the dynamics between Chaol and Dorian. And I did like that there was some fun Easter eggs in this scene, which we'll talk about when we get there.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, it's nice to see one-on-one interactions with characters.
Yes.
That, especially that you don't get a ton of. Because honestly, throughout Throne of Glass, Celaena's the main character. So any other characters that you have, typically they're interacting with her one-on-one. But we, again, don't see very much of Chaol and Dorian necessarily conversing with each other in
TOG or Con.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's them talking about Celaena. So it's nice to see them in a world before Celaena exists because we know from TOG and Con, they have a really close relationship. They've literally been friends since they were children. So it is nice to see them have a friendly conversation before Celaena Sardathian
enters the chat.
The scene. Yeah, definitely. And then last, Lorraine mentioned this at the top of the episode, but I just want to make sure just in case. So chronologically in the timeline, it's mid to end of summer. It's a 2-week journey to Endovir. And remember, they pick up Celaena right at the beginning of fall. And book-wise, that means it's been 1 year since the end of Tab. And this scene takes place roughly 3-4 weeks before the start of TOG. So when you're reading, for our sake, we did Throne of Glass, Calm, Tab. And this follows chronologically a year after the final story of Tab, if that makes sense. So if you're just starting TOG and somehow you came to this episode, you can listen to this one first and then start TOG if you want, and it won't really spoil anything.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. All right. So we start off with Dorian overlooking the rooftops of Rifthold. He reflects on the rainstorm gathering in the clouds that was sure to bring relief from the heat and stench of the city after weeks of unbearable heat, which also made council meetings quite miserable as well. He turns around to face Chaol, who asks him about his decision regarding the contest the King of Adarlan was hosting. Dorian notes that Chaol sounded worried and that he was always worrying. He goes on to respond that he found the contest absurd, a waste of gold, a waste of time, a waste of men's lives, and doesn't understand why he wants a champion considering how many shady people he likely has working for him already. Ooh, okay.
Yes, exactly.
Hot takes from Dorian.
Right? And specifically in relation to Chaol always worrying, I actually really like the quote I have written down here. It says, Chaol was always worrying, even if he rarely showed it. No, even in the heat, Chaol was still wearing his black uniform, still looking crisp and alert and ready to face any threat. And I wrote, LOL, some things never change, because that is just so Chaol to a T. And so it's just funny, like, no matter where we are in the timeline, Chaol's just this buttoned up, like ready to attack. Even at Leifer Bardingale's party, he was like on high alert. Chaol would make the perfect Secret Service agent. I am convinced of that.
That's so
he
true.
would be amazing.
He's always quite literally worrying about everything. So anyways.
I know.
Chaol advises him that the other council members have already picked their champions and that if he doesn't participate, it would signal the wrong message. Dorian reflects on how Chaol was well aware of his rocky relationship with his father, the king, and that it was getting harder and harder for him to submit to him. He thinks about the rebel movements and the labor camps of Calcula and in Dovier. Though he didn't support the rebels, he wonders if he was just as much a slave to the crown as the rest of the continent. So this was a pretty big theme for Dorian, particularly in TOG. Well, actually, all throughout TOG and Crown of Midnight, right? I think he felt very, what's the word that I'm looking for? Really boxed in and trapped. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he hated that he had to put on a front and play this role as the crown prince, and how he had all these responsibilities and duties that he had to perform that he really didn't want to. So this fits with that theme for him. Yeah. And it's interesting, I think, to see the transition, like how we are, back in the timeline, we have TOG, and then by the end of Crown of Midnight and stuff, I think Dorian's getting to a point where he's starting to worry for himself again, just because we learn that he has magic, and this is a huge problem for him because of the king and how the king really opposes magic and everything.
No, I had that exact same quote pointed out, and I'm really glad you pointed that out, because when we think about Dorian's character, especially as we progress through the series, Dorian is basically a prisoner of his father's court. Mm-hmm. Obviously, his plight is nowhere near as horrific as the people in Endovier and Calcula, but he is still prisoner pawn. He's really trapped. He doesn't really have a lot of options. He can't really escape. He's too recognizable, not to mention the king has magic and stuff, would probably be able to find him. Mm-hmm. He can't be too defiant because, honestly, I wouldn't put it past the king to actually imprison him and or actually kill him. Or, which of course, I'm not sure Dorian fully realizes this, but we as readers do, the king certainly has magical ways to manipulate Dorian to his will, even in ways Dorian doesn't know he's trapped without realizing it, And
right.
So, yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting character note for Dorian that seems to be really highlighted in this particular part of the scene.
I agree. Mm-hmm. Dorian decides if he had to play, then he was going to win the competition. So Chaol offers up some names from a list he had compiled, but Dorian refuses all of them, stating they're too ordinary.
We can't have that.
Never. Yeah, only the best. Dorian paces back to the window where he thinks about his last night out in Rifthold, which had been about a year ago. He had attended a lavish party where wealthy rebels from Melisande, the finest Adarlanian courtesans, and a mix of thieves, mercenaries, and Arabin Hommel's notorious assassins had attended as well. Though he hadn't been recognized thanks to the mask they wore, he wonders who he may have danced or clinked glasses with while there. And obviously this was like my favorite little reference here, because we speculated, if you guys listened to our Underworld episode for the Assassin's Blade already, then we were like, oh my god, that has to be Dorian, it has to be Chaol. Like, there's just no way that it wasn't. We got the sapphire eyes, Chaol's golden eyes, Chaol being all protective mode,
yes,
Dorian's grinning. There was just too many references to things, to like physical mannerisms and physical features that they both have.
Yes.
That we were like, okay, this is for sure them. But, this obviously gives us that for sure confirmation that our speculations were correct. So,
oh, definitely, because the timeline lines up. And then I also, it actually, in Dorian's thoughts, he says the party at the riverfront estate remained the most lavish Dorian had ever seen. And that description as well lines up with Leifert Bardingale's party.
Yeah.
It was on a riverfront. And if you'll recall, Celaena's descriptions were like, it was just so over the top. Like half-naked men passing out hors d'oeuvres and like women in corsets and cages and like acrobatics and, the works. And so even his description, I mean, it just has to be. If it's not, I don't even know why we're doing this. We're just bad at our jobs.
I think with 100% certainty now, we can say that it was them.
Absolutely. Yes. I also thought where it says Dorian had unwittingly danced and drank with them all. Even now, Dorian can suppress a chill at the thought of whom he might have been dancing with, which is absolutely hilarious because we know that he danced with Celaena and they had that little exchange where she was like, I'm nothing and no one and I'm the wind. And it's just a plot twist. It's so funny. And it's funny that he shudders to think what kind of criminals he was cavorting with. Plot twist. In about a year, he's going to end up falling in love with one of those criminals. And so I just thought this whole kind of sequence of thought was really funny, knowing what happens down the road.
Yeah.
Oh, so
it was all meant to happen,
Yeah.
As he stands, Dorian swears he feels a cool northern wind on his face, faintly scented with pine and snow. My first thought was this Celaena? Or
Oh, okay.
or just maybe even any kind of like Terrace related spirit calling to him. We know that Dorian himself never had contact with Celaena, but Celaena and who we speculate to be Nehemia had that conversation about, they said specifically the prince in their little conversation. Yeah. And so it could be that, I don't know, it could just be a separate northern Terrace related spirit, but in either case, it's like this call that both Celaena and Dorian are heavily involved in whatever is planned, this fate or whatever is going on, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely a call out to Terrace, especially the pine and snow scent. It is referenced so many times in TOG Common Tab, most recently at the very end of The Assassin and the Empire, and the chapter marked as beginning. There's a quote, "She knew the chill bite beneath it, knew it carried the hint of pine and snow, knew the mountains from which it was hailed, a northern breeze, a breeze of Terrace." And the series thus far is just chock full of references to that breeze. And so I think of it kind of like a symbolic representation of leading him to Celaena, because I just associate that so strongly with Celaena. But whether it's a spirit or whatever it is, it's totally a connection to Celaena.
And I think just his general importance to the story also, because remember, Nehemia touched his chest with the word mark and everything and activated something. And she told him that he was needed for bigger plans, etc., kind of being fated as well. Or she'd use similar language with him that Celaena often uses with Celaena. So has to be tied in.
Has to be, right?
So Dorian goes on to say that he wants Celaena Sardathian. We get a flashback of info where we learn a year ago Celaena had been sentenced to a lifetime of labor in Endovir. Dorian and Chaol had been on the coastal town of Syria at the time. Though they had raced back as soon as they heard, they missed her by the time they arrived back to Rifthold. Any person in documents that would have mentioned anything about her had been either sent away or sealed away, so they didn't even know how old she was even, right? So back in TOG, one of the things we had wondered about is whether Dorian and Chaol already knew Celaena when they had gone to recruit her for the tournament. And I think this would confirm that they knew of her and they knew her by name, but they had no idea what she looked like or how old she was. They had no other demographic information about her.
Yeah, I think they knew what everyone else knew, which was that her name was Celaena Sardathian and she was female. But nobody, even the king, was surprised at her age. And remember, at the end of Empire, the guards were like, there's no way that's her. She's way too young. It's probably some simple girl they snatched to take the blame. So I think you're right. I really don't think they have any information. And actually, I thought just kind of a nice parallel at the end of The Assassin of the Empire when Sam and Celaena are at the Black Signet Tavern. I think that's the right part of the story. But Celaena mentions she overhears patrons of the tavern talking about the prince and how he was on the coast of Syria.
Oh, yeah.
So just a nice little parallel that kind of ties the timeline of those two stories together.
And then again, this was a question we had posed.
Yes,
why? At the end of Empire, the final part of Tab as well, but it remains to be a large question and applies here as well because Dorian and Chaol mentioned this themselves. But obviously we want to know why the king is keeping her identity a secret. It just doesn't make a difference at this point because she's been captured. If anything, it seems like it'd be advantageous for him to tell people who she was so she couldn't continue on as an assassin in Rifthold were she ever to kick out or whatever. So I don't know. Again, it's just one of those weird things where we're like, what the hell is the king doing? What's his game plan with Celaena here? And like, why was her identity such a secretive thing for him?
Well, and I mean, Dorian, I think, has the same question because he even says, your guess is as good as mine. Maybe whoever, whatever she is, threatens him or undermines him in some way, which is so funny because in my opinion, that has some double meaning that, of course, Dorian couldn't know. Number one, it probably would be embarrassing if Adarlan's assassin was a 17-year-old girl. And secondly, her actual true identity as Aelin Galathinius is definitely a threat. And so there's some double meaning to Dorian's words. Of course, he doesn't know that. But I thought that was kind of interesting because you could read it either way.
Right. she's the single biggest threat to Adarlan.
Yes.
Like, literally ever. So
literally ever.
Chaol seems alarmed and wary of this decision and tries to dissuade him from choosing her as Dorian's champion, stating, "She's been in Endovir for a year, Dorian. I doubt she's much to look at. In fact, she's probably dead." This causes Dorian to question what he knows, and Chaol ends up revealing he had attempted to make inquiries about her, but they had all been left unanswered. Dorian argues back that didn't really mean anything since his father had likely given an order for all inquiries to be ignored. Chaol responds the question is why, though, which we just discussed, obviously, and Dorian ends up suggesting they go check for themselves to see whether she was dead or alive. They pose a couple more questions about her physical and mental state, but start discussing logistics of a trip to Endovir. Ultimately, Chaol allows Dorian to join for the trip with some conditions, which include traveling with men picked by Chaol. Chaol would ultimately be taking the lead, and that if it's deemed too dangerous to take her from the mines, then they'll abandon the idea altogether. Dorian briefly protests, implying Chaol was questioning his judgment, but agrees to the conditions, except the last one stating, in regards to Stardothian's suitability, we'll decide together. Chaol responds fine, promise you'll not let your desire to needle your father cloud your judgment, which Dorian promises to honor. And then the story ends with both men agreeing to Endovir then.
And off they go. And now we're at the start of TOG.
Yeah, I think overall, as we stated, it was interesting. And I think it helped confirm a couple details from the past, but it provides a little bit of insight into their relationship as well. Chaol's always been cautious and protective and dedicated to his job in protecting Dorian, while Dorian has always aspired to spite his father and get outside the castle and experience other things. So,
yeah, exactly. Pretty much. I think it's just a nice bridge between where we leave off in Tab and the beginning of TOG and what led Dorian and Chaol to where they end up in Endovir. And so, yeah, nice we have it and hooray for us. That's all
all right. So that rounds out our analysis. And now we just have our favorite moments to share. So, Addison, what were your favorite moments from this little short story?
So I only had two because it was so short. But I like when Dorian is thinking about just how overprotective his whole existence is. And the quote is, Dorian rolled his eyes. He might as well be living in the royal nursery. Which I thought was kind of funny. That's just such a common trope. You know, royal prince or princess feels so suffocated and they just want to be able to run free with abandon. And it's like, you got responsibilities. So sorry. But and and then I know I said this earlier, but I really like Chaol was always wearing, even if he rarely showed it. No, even in the heat, Chaol was still wearing his black uniform, still looking crisp and alert and ready to face any threat. And I thought this part was particularly funny because if you recall, even in Calm, when Celaena takes him for a special birthday dinner and she tells him to dress nice, and he just wears an all black outfit. It's not quite his uniform, but it's still, I have my work black pants, I have my relaxing black pants, and I have my fancy black pants. And that's all Chaol has. It just cracks me up.
Actually, this is really funny because I've been reading, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it comes together, I promise. So I've been listening to the Shepherd King series on audiobook. I just finished both One Dark Window and then 2 Twisted Crowns. I was driving and I had a long road trip. Girl, I was driving. I just popped in the audiobook and just took off. Excellent thing to do, by the way. I actually like driving long distances now that I actively have audiobooks to listen to. So
absolutely.
But in that series, there is a character named Elm. And one of the things about him that I just remember very distinctly, probably because of Chaol, is that he's always just wearing a black tunic. Like, he doesn't care to dress up or do anything else. The man is literally like Chaol in the sense that he just is always, that's his go-to outfit. He'll go to the balls and the parties and the feasts, like black tunic, and that's it. And so I just thought that was kind of funny.
Can you just imagine all those servants like trying to do all the laundry for the castle? And they like have this really complicated system to keep it organized, but they're like, oh, if it's black, it's Chaol's. So you just put it in that basket. That's Chaol's laundry. It's all black.
Makes it easy for them, I guess.
Right? What were your favorite moments?
Well, I had 3, but they're really short. So I had a quote from Dorian where he says, if I'm going to be press ganged into this competition, Dorian mused more to himself than his friend, then I want to win.
A winner's attitude. I like that.
Mm-hmm. And then I like the little reference to with the pine and the snow. I like that quote where it says, heartbeat, Dorian could have sworn he felt a cool northern wind on his face, faintly scented with pine and snow. Just because we know Dorian is fated and necessary to the story in a bigger way. We haven't uncovered everything yet, but
yeah,
he definitely is. And then the last one was a quote from Chaol where he says, promise you'll not let your desire to needle your father cloud your judgment. And Dorian goes, I wouldn't. And then Chaol gives him a pointed look. And Dorian lifted his eyes to the stone ceiling. Fine, I promise.
That is so Dorian. He's like, oh, okay, fine. Chaol's like his mother, kind of.
Yeah, it's big brother vibes. Which actually, if you think about it, I think Chaol is like a couple years older than Dorian, right?
I thought
he's at least a year.
Is he?
Yeah, because remember, Dorian I think is 19 at the start of the story, and Chaol is like 22 or something. If we remember, because Celaena asked him how old he is, and he's like,
oh yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Celaena's the youngest. Dorian's like a year or two older than her, and then Chaol's another year or two older than him than Dorian. So
good memory. I mean, I knew they're close, but I didn't remember the specifics. So glad someone on this podcast did their homework.
Sometimes I feel like I remember obscure details that maybe do not matter. But anyways, so yeah, those were all my favorite moments, and that concludes this mini bonus episode. So thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Fucked Up Fantasy podcast. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts. So please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review, or share it with all your friends who love fantasy fiction as well. You can also keep up with us on a daily basis by following us on social media, and all of those are linked below in the episode description. That's all we've got for you guys today. So stay nerdy, everyone, and we'll catch you all later for our very first episode covering Heir of Fire.
Ooh.
Bye.
Bye. Chaol anxiously waits at the castle gates for... No, wait. That's not right. Whoops. That is the wrong short story. Oops. Dorian suggests Celaena Sardathian Adarlan's. Dorian. Oh my God. Okay.
Oops, I accidentally muted myself. Okay.